And welcome in. It's another edition of Pilch's Perspective. Try to take a look at what's going on in the world and tie a historical perspective into it all. That's the main idea. Now, today I'm going to talk about one of those big hot button topics in the world of sports. I may be a little bit later to the party this time, but that's okay. That would fit me. We'll be talking about the college football playoff, but I'm going to look at it from a much different angle because so many people have been talking. Is college football broke? Does it need fixed? What have you? What I'm here to tell you is it's no different now than it ever has been. They just talk about it more, and that's why it's become an issue. And there's been discussions over what some believe is a lack of competitiveness right now in college football. Now, since the playoffs started in 2014, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma, they've taken 20 of the 28 potential playoff spots. Notre Dame now has two of them as well. You're starting to hear a lot of groaning about the same teams making it year in, year out, and how it's the blue bloods. And kind of once you get started, it's hard to get in. Now, when you look throughout all of college football history, there have essentially been three primary programs that from start to finish have never really had any prolonged downtime. And that's Alabama, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. Notre Dame has a great history, but once you hit after the title in '88, they hit a bit of a downturn. USC's had some great moments, but in between the great moments has been what they've been recently, just kind of blah. But those have really been the big three throughout most of college football history. And they've got things working in their favor, certainly. They're in states or areas of the country with a healthy supply of high school football talent. Ohio State's probably the one team not in the South or the West that wins consistently, but they're in kind of a hotbed for talent. In the state of Ohio, they're near Pennsylvania, Illinois, and since they've been a power for so long, they can dip into Texas and Florida and all that. Notre Dame has done a really good job with it too over the last few years. But what I find interesting is this talk of lack of competitiveness, and I never heard it mentioned before, even though there was just as much lack or perceived lack of competitiveness. Now, in the BCS era, that lasted for 16 seasons between 1998 and 2003. Florida State played for the championship 3 years in a row from 98 through 2000. And then they also played for it again in 2013. So in 16 seasons, Florida State played in 4 of the title games. Oklahoma played in 4 of those title games, winning 1. Ohio State, Alabama, and LSU played in 3 of them. Again, a lot of those same names are popping up. So that's, what is that? 5 schools that played in at least 3 BCS title games, and the BCS was only around for 16 seasons. And those were only 2 teams then, okay? I never once heard anybody complain about that being an issue, lack of competitiveness during the BCS. And if you take really any decade in college football history or any 10-year cycle, if you will, you'll notice just a handful of teams dominate any 10-year period. Lately, it's been Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and then sort of Oklahoma. If you think back to the 2000s, it was really Oklahoma, Ohio State, USC, and Florida. Alabama under Nick Saban didn't really get going until the end of the decade. In the 90s, Ohio State was still there, but that was one era where Oklahoma was just not overly good. But Florida State throughout the entirety of the 90s was elite. Nebraska won 3 national titles in 4 years. Never heard anyone complain then. In the 80s, it was Miami, Penn State, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. In fact, if you look at the winning percentages by decade throughout college football history, you go into the 90s, you have Oklahoma, Texas, Florida, Ohio State, USC, LSU, and Georgia all there. Actually, that's 2000s. In the 90s, it was Florida State, Nebraska, Florida, Michigan, Penn State are there. Ohio State is there. You look into the 80s, you get Nebraska, Miami, Florida State, Oklahoma, Alabama, Notre Dame. You'll look into the 70s here, Alabama, Oklahoma, USC, Ohio State. They've always been there when you look at the top 10 winning percentages of programs by decade or even any 10-year period. Those schools are going to pop up on the list all the time. with the exception of maybe a little down spell here and there. They have always been the good programs, and there's a lot of reasons for that. So this is nothing new. In fact, you're just going to see the same teams on the list year in, year out. What I find interesting is you had all of John Wooden's championships at UCLA. From 64 to 75, UCLA won 10 titles in 12 years. And people look at it now as Wooden being this savant. They kind of look at Saban the same way, granted. And the greatness of that dynasty, now it just annoys people that Alabama dominates the way they do. Don't quite get that. In 9 seasons between 1986 and 1994, Duke was in the Final Four 7 times. They played in the title game in 90, 91, 92, and 94. Sort of a 5-year span. They played the title game 4 times and then played in it again in 99 and in 2001. I never heard anybody complain about Duke dominating college basketball to that extent during that same time period. And you had a period where, you had the Fab Five getting to back-to-back Final Fours. You had Indiana and kind of Bobby Knight's last good years, the Calbert Cheaney years through the 80s and into the early 90s were there all the time. UCLA had a run in the late 2000s where they made a lot of Final Four. Nobody complained about it then. And granted, this is a 7-year period for college football, but you're getting other periods in other sports where people don't complain about it in the same way. Now, the NBA has been full of non-competitiveness basically for its history, because in basketball, the great players just dominate the game. They play both sides of the floor. They play the whole game. You can give the ball to them whenever you want. That's what the same teams win all the time. The Warriors and the Cavs played 4 straight years. When the finals ended in 2015 and 2016, you knew they were going to meet in the finals again a year later. You knew that, barring major injuries. Okay. 4 years in a row, people talked about how great it is. And I never heard anyone talk about the lack of competitiveness. Before Cleveland went 4 straight years, Miami went 4 straight years. I really don't get it. The Lakers going from 2000 to 2002 and then 2004, then again in 2009 and 2010, they had 9 NBA Finals appearances in 12 years between 1980 and 1991. The Bulls won 6 titles in 8 years in the 90s, and they talk about how great they were and how great Jordan was, not the lack of competitiveness. And you look, they played Utah in 2 of those years. During that same time period, Portland went to 2 in 3 years. Houston won 2 in a row in the years the Bulls didn't win it. You'd have the Knicks getting to deep into the playoffs every year against the Bulls in the East, or it was the Pacers. It was the same teams all the time. Nobody ever talks about it. The Celtics went to the finals 12 times in 13 years between 57 and 69, won 11 titles. Things were a lot different prior to the 1980s. I might get into that a little bit. Celtics went to 4 straight finals, 84 to 87. Pistons had 3 straight appearances, 88 to 90. You get the point. You can go back throughout the entire history of that league, and that's what you got. The Lakers won the title last year. They're probably going to get to the finals this year, barring the fact that Brooklyn's healthy. It's probably going to be against Brooklyn because they've got 3 studs there. I don't hear people complaining about that year in, year out. Not to mention the fact that recently the New England Patriots went to 9 Super Bowls in 18 years and played in the AFC title game 13 times in 18 seasons. Instead, we hear about how great the NFL is and that there's parity in the NFL. When you look at some of the results of the 4 major sports, the NFL is probably the second least competitive league. Now, outside of the NBA, the other 3 are fairly close. But it's actually not as competitive as they tell you it is. It's just what they sell and what they tell you, so people kind of buy into it. The NFC has been fairly competitive. The AFC has been the same teams for a long time. If it wasn't the Patriots, it was the Steelers. They've been to 6 title games since 2001 and a lot more since 1992. A lot of 12-win seasons, a lot of playoff appearances. How about this? The Colts went 11-5 between 1999 and 2014. In a 16-year span, their average record was 11-5 and had 7 straight seasons when they were 12-4 or better. I heard how great Peyton Manning and all those quarterbacks were. I never heard about the lack of competitiveness and the fact that the same teams were there all the time. Even the Chargers, the Colts, the Ravens had a ton of playoff experience or appearances from the 90s on to now. It hasn't changed. The NFC, I mean, you've got the Packers that have been there lately. The Seahawks have been on a heck of a run. The Saints. People don't talk about that. You get more teams invited, but you're getting the same teams going deep year in, year out. I don't get why it's not a big deal. You know, I don't see the Browns, the Bengals, the Jets, the Bills, the Cardinals, the Lions, Washington, Atlanta. They're not there that often, here and there, but apparently that doesn't count, though. I've never understood that. And on top of that, Tom Brady's not played in 10 of the last 20 Super Bowls and won 7 of them, but that doesn't count. It all comes down to how well you run your organization, how good you are at player development, how little the owners get involved, not micromanaging everything, just letting you do your job, giving some money when needed and staying out of it. And that's just the way it is. Now, in fairness, sports history prior to the 1980s was pretty one-sided. You'd have a lot of dynasties that would win multiple titles and have multiple playoff appearances at one. Here's some more numbers with the college football and talking about how it's always been the same way. USC has won 39 of the 90 Pac-12 championships. That is 43% of them. Florida State won the ACC 15 times in 23 seasons between 1992 and 2014. Talked about their BCS successes. Clemson's won the last 6. Before Florida State joining the ACC in 1991, nobody had ever won the ACC more than 3 consecutive years. Also wasn't really much of a football conference. It was always a basketball conference, really, until Florida State got to that level in the 1990s. Oklahoma has destroyed the Big 12. Now, historically, the Big 8, which later became the Big 12, used to be the Southwest Conference. It's always been a very non-competitive conference. Kansas State, Kansas, Iowa State have been some of the worst programs in college football history, and they all play in that conference. Oklahoma once won 12 conference titles in a row in the 40s and 50s. I'll have some more Sooner dominance in a bit. USC dominated in the 90s, dominated really in the 2000s, had a mini run in the 60s. Now, I mentioned the amount of titles USC has won in the Pac-12, the overwhelming percent. They have kind of spread that out. They won in 3 or 4 years in a row, take 3 or 4 years off, win 3 or 4 more. And then the others are kind of divvied up. But lately, that's been kind of Oregon and USC sharing that. But they've still won the vast majority of the titles in that league's history. In the 70s, Bama won 8 SEC titles in 9 years and lost 3 conference games during that span. That was the Bear Bryant years. Iowa State hasn't won a conference since 1912. That's the year the Titanic sunk. Think of Jack and Rose dancing down below, having a good time with the steerage level individuals and them having their hoity-toity thing upstairs. Those are the people, and that's the era that was around the last time Iowa State won a conference. Okay. Speaking of Iowa State, they're an interesting breed here because there's a lot of people through college football that don't really like Iowa State because they kind of break all the rules in some ways. Because there's some people that like to say, well, it's not our fault. We can't compete. We're out-resourced. We don't have the kids in our area. It's the college football system keeping us down. Okay. It's meant to benefit the big few and sends everyone else down. That's what you've heard lately. Well, we don't have the money. We don't have the facilities. As big as staff, we can't recruit. Iowa State had an athletic department that had a little over $50 million in total revenue in 2019. Texas had $223 million. Who's been the better team the last couple of years? Their facilities have never been in the top 25 or top 30. Coaching size isn't close to Alabama or Ohio State or Texas. Their recruiting classes, I've got it right here, over the past 4 years, according to 24/7, is 59th, 46th, 46th, and 55. They went 9-3 this past year, 8-5, 8-5, 7-6, 9-3 over the past 4 years. Played for the Big 12 title, beat Oregon in the Fiesta Bowl, and they're returning as much as anyone this next coming year. It's probably going to be Iowa State or Oklahoma to win the Big 12, or at least it would look that way, going into the season. They're doing this against schools with significantly larger resources. It's your coaching hires and the way you run your program, because Matt Campbell has done whatever he's wanted to there, and he's building them up to get better and better. And this might be their best year yet coming up. but they're not making those other schools that can't do that or don't want to put the amount of resources and time into it happy, because they're proving you can do it. It's about coaches. It's about process. It's about culture. Granted, college football, the geography plays a big role in it. Okay. It doesn't mean you can't compete for conference titles or even make a playoff appearance. Winning a national title is a bit tougher, but Wisconsin 2 years has had 2 seasons where if they won the Big Ten title game, they would have made the playoff. Utah last season, not last season, but 2019, if you remember, had they won the Pac-12 title game, would have gone to the playoff. Okay. Baylor and TCU came close that first year. It's not that those teams aren't knocking on the door. They've been knocking on the door. They haven't just gotten in yet. But Iowa State's one of those schools proving, yeah, you can win here without resources. You can win here. Can they win a national title? They're not at that point yet. No. But can they make the playoff, which is what everyone's complaining about? Yeah, they could make the playoff. Remember, before the last 6 years, Clemson was just another school. People talk about Clemson like they've been around forever. Clemson was just a school that happened to play football in the ACC, and it took Dabo time to build that program up. They've never, ever been a blue blood. They aren't exactly in a hotbed. They're in a hotbed. They're in the South. They're in a pretty good recruiting area, and Dabo's found a way to make inroads there. But if you can take a program like Clemson and turn it into what they've become, why can't other programs? LSU won the title in 2019. They had never come close to the playoff before that year. I understand they recruit well. I understand they've, since really Saban got there in the 2000s, been a pretty good program. But if what they're saying is true, that you can't crack the party, LSU wouldn't have cracked the party. It's kind of like when the Iowa State thing I was talking about, it's kind of like when baseball owners cry they can't win because they're in a small market, despite the St. Louis Cardinals being a small market team and not having a big local TV deal and winning all the time. Cleveland, with an owner that really doesn't care, basically winning all the time because their front office is good. The Padres are the 8th smallest market and have the 8th smallest TV deal in baseball. And they've got 2 $300 million players, 2 $100 million players, along with Snell and Darvish. When your owner cares, you win because all these teams have a ton of money. It's kind of the same thing. It's a little different, but when you've got all these donors in the background that are worth millions on their own coming from your school, you've got the money to put it in there if you want to put it in there. But the playoff is essentially the only thing fans seem to care about right now, because the network that owns it and runs it and covers it, it's all they talk about. They send out your 4 playoff teams after week 1 or 2. After week 2, who would be in? Well, it doesn't really matter till after the conference title games, but sure, let's do it. Look how often that who's in spot runs throughout the season. They do that because they paid billions for it. I get it. But the reason people are talking about needing new juice is because some of the higher ups at that network and others talk about it a lot. If they wouldn't bring it up, I don't think the average fan would bring it up. Did you ever hear the phase opt out until the college football playoff began? Because I didn't. There are 4 teams that make the playoff. In the BCS era, there were 2. They play in the title game. That didn't make all the other games and bowl games irrelevant then. Why does it now? Players didn't opt out of bowl games then. They do now. They never opted out until people on networks and like started talking about it. It's kind of interesting how that all ties together. If they talk about it, people will pick up on it, and that becomes the hot topic, whether it's what people are actually talking about or not. That's just kind of the way human beings work. There was a conversation on a network about devaluing playoff games on a network that talks about playoff games and the playoff race in every single game it broadcasts. So they're talking about devaluing non-playoff games on this network, while that network's then talking about playoff games and the playoff race every single time. They go back then talking about the playoff 5 minutes later. They didn't talk about it. And if they didn't tell you there was an issue in college football, you wouldn't talk about it. You can go out throughout all of college football history, and it is no different now than it ever has been. Some people are saying, well, it changes now because kids are going to the schools that are making the playoff. Well, no, they weren't. LSU's been at the top of the recruiting rankings are in the top 5 to 10. They made the playoff once. Oregon made it once the first year. Mario Cristobal, since he got there, they were what? They had the 5th best class in the nation last year. All of a sudden, they're not making the playoff every year. They're up there. Alabama, Ohio State, and Clemson are up there because they've kind of always been up there. Kids go to the school that's going to give them the best chance to get to the NFL. That is the number one thing kids look for. And if those schools give them that opportunity, that's where they're going to go. They look at what schools have produced the most NFL talent. You can change that around. You can get a good staff on hand, hire the right people, stay out of their way, let them do their work, and they can start creating some NFL talent. Look at Texas is another example, who recruit really well, top 5, top 6, no playoff appearances despite recruiting well. And the amount of 4 and 5-star players they get. And when you look at their recruiting rankings and then compare it to the amount of guys that are in the NFL from Texas, they have an issue producing players when they get to campus. Player development. Recruiting is as important as it is. In the end, player development is really more important. You take schools like Wisconsin that don't recruit as high, though Wisconsin's recruited very well the last 2 years. And they play well by the time they're junior and seniors because they have good coaches. They have a good system in place, and that's how it works. Do you think if Boise State, which has been a very good program, do you really think that they would be able to out-recruit Alabama, Clemson, OSU, or Georgia if they made 1 or 2 playoff appearances when schools are after the same players? Don't think so. It didn't help Washington. They got there 1 year. That's a nice program. It didn't really help them in recruiting. So I just kind of wanted to set the record straight on what has actually happened throughout all of college football history when you're talking about competitiveness. And then I want to show all the lack of competitiveness there have been in other sports at other times or for all time, because that's not being talked about. Only the college football part's being talked about. I don't like that because all the information is not out there. And so I wanted to give you an idea of what is really, really out there and what has actually happened and what the truth of it actually is, and not what things are maybe perceived to be. I am Mike Pilch. This is Pilch's Perspective. I try to tie a lot of current events into the history of everything and what has really happened, maybe just give you a different perspective on things, if anything else. So I am Mike Pilch. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk to you again in about a week.